All right, welcome everyone and early happy Thanksgiving. We start the week of Thanksgiving. Um, Today we are going to deal with one of the most famous passages in the Bible. It's in Judaism, it's called the Akedah, the binding, for the binding of Isaac. And again, it's one of those stories that we've heard so many times that it almost becomes a cliche to us. So hopefully by the time we get done today, we'll appreciate a little bit about the complexity of it, some of the heaviness of it, and figure out some ways to say, so what do we do with this as people of faith moving forward? So let me share my screen with you. And first, let's read the entire passage, and then we'll kind of go back through and break it down. All right, can everybody see? All right, so remember, we've gone through the story of Abraham's move and relocation, his quest for an heir, his wanting to just adopt Eliezer, his use of Hagar to have Ishmael, then ultimately his biological son with Sarah named Yitzhak, meaning he laughs. Because at first they mocked, and in the end they thought it was just so happy and joyful. And everything seems like it's rolling along, and God's promise for this great name, great nation, and all these heirs seems right on course. And then today we hit the bend in the road. After these things, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham. He said, here I am. He said, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah or Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took two of his young men with him and his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering and set out and went to the place in the distance that God had showed him. On the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place far away. Then Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. So the two of them walked on together. Isaac said to his father Abraham, Father. And he said, Here I am, my son. He said, the fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? Abraham said, God himself will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So the two of them walked on together. When they came to the place that God had showed him, Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to kill his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, The Lord will provide. As it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, By myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will indeed bless you, and I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of the enemies. And by your offspring shall all the nations of the earth gain blessing for themselves, because you have obeyed my voice. So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived in Beersheba. And then the chapter closes. Now, after these things, it was told Abraham, Milcah also has borne children to your brother Nahor, Uz the firstborn, Buz his brother, Kemuel the father of Aram, Chesed, Hazo, Pildash, Jidlaph, and Betuel. Betuel became the father of Rebekah. These 8 Milcah bore to Nahor, Abraham's brother. Moreover, his concubine, whose name was Ruma, bore Teba, Gaham, Tahash, and Makkah. Again, those seem like they're irrelevant details, but remember our genealogies, and Rebecca is going to become important in our story. So it's kind of a linking story with what will come next. But let's just back up here now. So again, probably nothing in there that strikes you like, oh, I've never heard that before. But maybe there are some things that stick out to you differently. So let me just ask this. Now that we've been reading through Genesis carefully, and we've been talking about Abram and Abraham, the character, we talked about the different themes and motifs working through it, does anything stick out in this story differently than maybe you've noticed it before?
I've heard it brought up that they're significant to the fact that Abraham says, when they separated.
Say that one more.
In verse, on verse 5, that Abraham tells his servants, we will come back to you, not
Yeah.
I will.
Yeah. So
Right before verse 6.
Have people noticed that before?
Do you consider that significant? I mean,
Well,
because I've heard it brought up.
Yes. Here's what I would say about that. Now, again, think about the context of what we've read, and this will show you maybe more how my mind works, and you can accept that or reject that. When most preaching happens on this in many traditions, it's that there's no way God was going to kill Abraham's kid. Foregone conclusion. This is an object lesson. It's a test of faith. So it's often argued Abraham knows it, and he's speaking in terms of faith. Possible reading, right? Torah is like a diamond, right? 70 faces, turn it, turn it, turn it again. But I would also make the case, if we look at Abraham and the way he's functioned throughout the story as the person who uses his wits and is willing to tell little fibs to survive in foreign lands and deal with tricky situations. According to one of the rabbinic texts, and we can't prove this, some have argued that Isaac is about 37 years old. He's at least a young adult. Abraham is over 100. If he says to the servants, hey, you stay here, I'm going to kill my kid now, he loses his beast of burden who's going to carry the wood. And when his son starts asking these questions, it's kind of like the old fairy tales of the kid asking the witch when he's going to get boiled alive, like, hey, where's the food? What's for dinner? Hey, I'm having you for dinner. Oh, great, right? There's this kind of like disappearance versus reality. So it's I think in its context in the book of Genesis, it's easy to see how Abraham is saying what he needs to say to get to the place of following God's command.
One thing that I noticed the first time this time is that throughout here, we have had people questioning God. Like when he told Abraham, you're going to have a son of your own wife. He went, no, how's this? She's too old, I'm too old, blah, blah, blah. When they're going up there, Isaac said, hey, wait a minute, what about, we didn't take any lamb up. But when they strap him down on the fire, Isaac says nothing.
Yeah.
I know that struck out me this time, that you'd think that he'd have something to say about that. And Father put him on top of that wood and brought the fire towards him.
Right, exactly right. And you know what? The other thing, this constantly questioning and asking questions of God, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when God says, "Hey, take your son to the place I show you and kill him," he's like, "All right." And he gets up early in the morning and off he goes.
Yeah, that was the same reaction. I mean, he argues for the righteous, but he doesn't. It's like,
right.
what?
He was arguing for the people at Sodom and Gomorrah, but here he's like, "All right, whatever it takes." Now, a couple of before we move forward, any other things strike you differently now that we've been reading Genesis as a whole about this passage? Let me point out a few textual things, and then we'll look a little bit at the tradition and ways people have interpreted this. Within the story itself, he's told to go to the land of Moriah, all right? And I'll show you a mountain there. This is usually interpreted as what's called Mount Moriah or Mount Moriah, which is the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. So within later tradition, Jewish and Christian and Muslim actually, the argument is the hill that he takes him to off in the distance is the place where later the temple would be built. So we don't really know in the Bible about a land of Moriah, but later in biblical tradition, there's Mount Moriah. And so a mountain in the land of Moriah is usually considered to be, and it's referred to later in Chronicles as the place where the temple is built. So again, this is also seen as like this potential sacrifice at a place where all the sacrifices would be. As he marches him off, again, there's the questioning, which again, from a literary perspective, right, that like builds the tension. It's like the more the kid starts asking questions, it's like, oh, it's pointing out where the story breakdown, right? And by story breakdown, I mean the story Abraham's telling. Hey, we're off to go have a sacrifice. As we get to this point, where they get there, it's interesting, and I'm going to show you some artwork in a bit. Abraham takes out the knife to kill him once his son somehow is bound and lying on the altar. And again, this is a young man at this point. It's not, sometimes we picture him like this little like 5-year-old. He's an adult. And as he goes to sacrifice him, God says, stop. And again, this is one of those rabbinic things. And then it says, Abraham reached out his hand. He took the knife to kill his son, but the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, do not lay your hands on the boy or do anything to him. People are like, what do you mean lay your hands on him? There's a certain rabbinic tradition is that an angel grabs the knife and takes it away. And then that Abraham goes to like strangle his son. And God's like, don't even lay a hand on him. Like, don't touch him. That there's this Abraham is so dedicated to the cause that God's got to really call him off, right? It's not just don't stab him, don't even touch him. Don't hurt him. And again, and then they look and here's this ram over in the bushes that saves the day. Once the new sacrifice comes, God reaffirms his promise to Abraham, right? He swears to him, because you've done this thing, now your offspring will be great. You're going to possess the land, right? The blessing and cursing stuff, you'll be a nation. All that stuff is reaffirmed in this. And then we hear about other parts of the family tree. Now, again, in one of those where I always love the backstories to things or the part of the narrative we don't hear about, I would love to see a little short story about the interactions between Abraham and Isaac on the way back down the mountain, right? The kind of every time Abraham goes to scratch his head, the kid flinches. Like there's a weird, like as your kids get older, there's weird enough dynamics anyway. And that's without strapping a guy down, lying to him on a long journey, and then trying to sacrifice him.
I imagine Isaac having PTSD from this.
Yes, yes. And we will talk about that because that comes up in Jewish tradition, that it says not only does Isaac have PTSD, we as a people have PTSD because we got spared from that one. But when is it coming next? Okay. Any other comments about just what for now we'll call the surface reading of the narrative? It makes sense. We see how it fits together. We see how it fits into the book of Genesis. And again, I see this story on a literary level in Genesis as the pinnacle of Abraham's faith. Because as he is wrestling with how will I have this heir, and it finally seems like it all comes to fruition, not an adoptee, not through a concubine, but through his wife, but then being told that this one is to be sacrificed. It is an act of faith saying, even though she's now over 100, I believe God could create another. Okay? That is not where the later tradition is going to go with the reading of this story. But I think in the flow of the story, that makes sense. And at this point, God realizes, look, you would do anything for me. And, and so this blessing is affirmed. Let me show you, let's talk about this story and some of the complexities in its tradition. Let me give some background, which makes it even more interesting, because there's a lot going on here. So the Akedah, again, if you ever hear the Akedah, that means the binding, and that's the Hebrew word for and he bound Isaac. Here are some famous pictures of this. Again, you have the angel grabbing the arm. Here's a more modern picture, and you see the ram over. Looks like he's resting under the tree. Doesn't look. Another. There's a famous relief in a Christian church where, again, in Judaism, it's a major motif, but we'll talk about how for Christianity it is as well. And here we see Abraham has something that looks closer to a sword, but it's also, look, it's Trinitarian. And it's as if you have the 3 loaves. You have the ram kind of biting at his garment. You have the hand of God coming out of the clouds. It's just a very fascinating passage. Now, let's talk about the ancient Near Eastern context, right? That's where we always need to begin with this stuff. Let me read some Leviticus to set background. Because child sacrifice was a common occurrence in the ancient world. Leviticus 18 says to Israelite readers, "You shall not give any of your offspring to sacrifice them to Molech and to profane the name of God, of your God. I am the Lord." Then later in Leviticus, say further to the people of Israel, any of the people of Israel or of the aliens who reside in Israel, who give any of their offspring to Molech shall be put to death. The people of the land shall stone them to death. I myself will set my face against them and will cut them off from the people, because they have given of their offspring to Molech, defiling my sanctuary and profaning my holy name. And if the people of the land should ever close their eyes to them, and when they give of their offspring to Molech, and do not put them to death, I myself will set my face against them and against their family, and will cut them off from among their people, them and all who follow them, and prostituting themselves to Molech. So that raises some questions for us. This is an artist rendition of Molech. Molech was believed to be a Canaanite deity for whom babies were to be sacrificed. There's other language about passing your seed through the fire or through the flame to Molech. And so there is this notion, and this, again, no one's ever found any kind of statue that looks like this. But there was a belief in scholarship that in the ancient Near East, child sacrifice was a part of the religious landscape. And it wouldn't just be in the ancient Near East. We know other places in the world where children were sacrificed. The Canaanite cultures, which later moved to Carthage. So, right, all that stuff with like the Punic Wars, and the people from Carthage have their roots in Canaanite culture. At a later date, they still find altars with bones of little children. But so this idea that in ancient Near East, in the area of Israel, people would sacrifice their children. Now, for those of you who read James Michener's The Source with me, as we talked about, backdrop for ancient Israel, you have in the chapter of Death and Life, this in the back of the mindset of Michener, this idea that babies would be brought forth. And he even shows, let me show you this picture. Here's what he's basing it on. This idea that there was some kind of a statue of an idol in which the baby would be placed, and then somehow it would fall into the flames. This was an idea that somehow by giving your offspring, and again, firstborn were seen as the ones that needed to be sacrificed. It basically was an offering to the gods that would benefit the people and bring profundity to your lands, fertility to the people by making a sacrifice. The same way you'd sacrifice a goat, and then, right, it would produce more animals in theory and bring fertility to your land. Thought the same worked with people. This has come to be doubted in the modern world, but it's hard to stop an old tradition. People have thought this way for hundreds of years. One of my professors at Hebrew Union College, Stephen Kaufman, he has argued that there was never a deity called Molech. He argues that there was a type of sacrifice, and he's found text to demonstrate it, called a Moloch or Moloch sacrifice. The root word for Molech is the same root letters that we have for the Hebrew word for king or royalty. And he argues that there was a certain kind of sacrifice, and there were layers to it, levels. Like on a lowest level, it was like, I think they sacrificed a bird. At a higher level, they sacrificed a donkey. At the highest level, if you were most serious, you would sacrifice a child. And that then the gods would take that very seriously, because you definitely were holding nothing back from God. So let me read you a story. This is one of those stories in the Bible where it's, people don't talk about this one a lot because it's so disturbing. So there's this whole story in 2 Kings, how the Israelites were going to fight the Moabites, and they were told to do it, and they rally their troops, and, off they go. And, oh, wait, that's not the one. Let me find this passage. Maybe I didn't copy it into the PowerPoint. No, let me pull it up real fast. Sorry, let me add this passage real quickly. All right, 2 Kings chapter 3. Can you see this? Can people see the text? All right.
It's not on the screen yet.
It's not. Okay, let me do this. I'll stop sharing and reshare. Sorry about that. I thought I had this embedded, but I guess I didn't. Whoop. All right, now you see it? Okay, so chapter 3, they're going to go fight Mesha, king of Moab. Okay, and they're talking it through, and they've been told to do this. And anyway, let's come down a ways. Now the Moabites had heard that the kings had come to fight against them. So every man, young and old, who could bear arms was called upon and stationed on the border. When they got up early in the morning, the sun was shining on the water. To the Moabites across the way, the water looked red like blood. That's blood, they said. Those kings must have fought and slaughtered each other. Now the plunder, Moab. But when the Moabites came to the camp of Israel, the Israelites rose up and fought them until they fled. And the Israelites invaded the land and slaughtered the Moabites. They destroyed the towns, and each man threw a stone on every good field until it was covered. They stopped. This is like, the forking someone's yard, right? So they throw rocks on their yard into their fields. They stopped up all the springs. They cut down every good tree. Only Kir Hareseth was left with its stones in place, but men armed with slings surrounded it and attacked it, right? So on every level, the Israelites are slaughtering them. They're winning the day. When the king of Moab saw that the battle had gone against him, he took with him 700 swordsmen to break through the king of Edom, but they failed. Then he took his firstborn son, who was to succeed him as king, and offered him as a sacrifice on the city wall. The fury against Israel was great. They withdrew and returned to their own land. So this sacrifice by the king of Moab of his son all of a sudden turns the battle, and Israel has to retreat. All right. Okay, let me jump back to our PowerPoint because I want to share another similar story of this kind of Molech sacrifice. Here is even more horrifying. This is in the same book, later in 2 Kings. In the 17th year of Pekah, son of Remaliah, King Ahaz, son of Jotham of Judah, began to reign. Ahaz was 20 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. He did not do what was right in the sight of the Lord his God, as his ancestor David had done, but he walked in the way of the kings of Israel. He even made his son pass through fire, according to the abominable practices of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. And then we hear he sacrificed and made offerings on the high places, on the hills, and under every green tree. This euphemism of made his son pass through the fire, this is the language that we hear about sacrificing a child, making them pass through the fire. So most scholars think that here you even have a king of Israel partaking in child sacrifice. So some scholars, when they look at this passage and they say, just wait, what in the world is going on here? Because other places in scripture, God says, I hate child sacrifice. I would never ask such a thing. And then people go, just wait, but you told Abraham to do it, right? If you say, I'd never asked such a thing, why would you ask Abraham to do it? Some scholars say, at one level, this story is about how this is something Israelites were doing, but it's saying, look, all the way back with our ancestor who was about to carry this out, what did God do? He stops him. He says, don't lay a hand on him. I will provide another kind of sacrifice. So some people see in this story the story that undoes the Israelite feeling like they needed to, were supposed to, or it was just an attractive thing to do because it was seen as a powerful, like, spiritual act to gain God's favor, that God says, I wouldn't do that, and tells Abraham not to. So some see it like that's the base level of this story, that it's the story that is supposed to end child sacrifice in ancient Israel. And their argument is, right, you don't keep telling people not to do something throughout the law code unless somebody's actually doing it, right? And they say this would be the narrative side of saying, see, you shouldn't do this. Abraham, our father, even though he seems commanded to do it, God finally shows it's not to be done. Okay? So that's one level of the way this story is read. On another level, it raises all kinds of questions within Judaism. Because the question becomes, well, just wait, why would this even be a possibility in the first place? I hear you saying, God, that I would never do this, but then why would you ask it? Why would this become part of the story? Well, Judaism will wrestle with that. And there's all kinds of explanations. And one of the most common ones is that Abraham knew from the start God wasn't going to make him follow through. So it was really a faith show. And this is out of Ginsburg's Legend of the Jews. There's this conversation. Again, this is, we talked earlier about Midrash, where it's scripture that reads between the lines that becomes scripture in Judaism. Let me just read for you this back and forth, right? Then when Abraham commanded, let me back up here. When God commanded, sorry, I'm having a problem here. Here it is. When God commanded the father to desist from sacrificing Isaac, Abraham said, one man tempts another because he knoweth not what is in the heart of his neighbor. But thou truly didst know that I was ready to sacrifice my son, right? So people test people because they don't know. But you knew that I wouldn't do it. Why did we do this? God says, it was manifest to me, and I foreknew it, that thou wouldst withhold not even thy soul from me. And Abraham says, and why then didst thou afflict me thus? Right? If you knew it, why did you make me go through this? And God said, it was my wish that the world should become acquainted with thee, and should know that it is not without good reason that I have chosen thee from all the nations. Now it hath been witnessed unto men that thou fearest God. All right, so wrestling with this idea of God's foreknowledge, right? How would you put a father through this if you would know what he was going to do anyway? And one of the ways Jewish theologians have wrestled with this is to say, well, it wasn't just for Abraham's testing. It was to give a picture for all people of all time what kind of person Abraham was. Now, not all Jewish tradition takes it that positively. And let me talk about this a little bit. Within modern Jewish thinking, there is still a lot of wrestling. When you read, and I've read a number of different things where there is a movie called, I always get this one wrong, I think it's called The Believer, where it's based on a true story about these neo-Nazi skinheads who are like terrorizing Jews in New York. And as the plot starts to go on, you realize that the kid who's the skinhead is actually grew up in a Jewish tradition. He's part of a Jewish family. And you start to see this like inner turmoil of like, why is this Jewish kid, right, responding this way? And in the flashbacks in the story, said he gets so bothered by the Akedah reading this story in rabbinic school. and trying to rationalize how such a thing could come to pass and how could a God do such a thing. So there is within the modern Jewish psyche this, where does this story fit in? And how do we understand it related to the nature of God? All the more does this become exacerbated post-Holocaust. And at Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem, they have a collection, and I was looking at some of this stuff online this week, where they were talking about the ongoing Jewish understanding of itself as a people and as a nation in light of the Akedah. And there's this song, it's a poem, but I just want to read this to you, just as, because they have this as like a lesson of like how Jewish poets wrestle with the Akedah in light of Holocaust in the modern state of Israel. And it says, "The ram came last of all, and Abraham did not know that it came to answer the boy's question. First of his strength when his day was on the wane. The old man raised his head, seeing that it was no dream and that the angel stood there, the knife slipped from his hand. The boy, released from his bonds, saw his father's back. Isaac, as the story goes, was not sacrificed. He lived for many years, saw what pleasure had to offer until his eyesight dimmed. But he bequeathed that hour to his offspring. They are born with a knife in their hearts." And within, let me read you one more of these. "Every year, our father Abraham would take his son to Mount Moriah, the way I take my children to the Negev hills, where I once had a war." This is a modern Israeli speaker. "Abraham hiked around with his sons. This is where I left the servants behind. That's where I tied the donkey to a tree at the foot of the mountain. And here, right here, Isaac, my son, you ask. Behold the fire and the wood. But where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Then up a little further, you asked for the second time. Then they reached the mountaintop. They rested a bit, ate and drank, and he showed them the thicket where the ram was caught by its horns. After Abraham died, Isaac started taking his sons to the same place. Here I lifted the wood. This is where I got out of breath. Here I asked, and my father answered, God will see to the lamb for the offering. Over there, I already knew it was me. And when Isaac's eyes were dim with age, his children led him to that same spot on Mount Moriah. And I recounted for him all that had come to pass, all that he might have forgotten." In Israel, there is this tradition of taking young children, and there's a lot of hiking in Israel. There's great trails, and it's like, this is part of like their heritage. We need to know our land step by step, foot by foot. But in the hiking, there's the conversation of, and this battle happened here, and here's what happened in the War of Independence, and here's where people died in the 6-Day War, and here's where they died in the Yom Kippur War. And so there is this like rehearsed memory of the struggle we've had and how we figure out our place in the world and the threats to our lives and the fact that God is with us, but that it doesn't always feel that way. And so modern Judaism continues to wrestle with this passage. Now, let me, any comments about that or questions? So what about Christianity? Let me point out some things in our passage. Let me go back. There are some powerful things in this passage as resonances where from ancient times Christians saw in this story a foreshadowing. That this story, right? Like so many things in scripture, And this is even Pauline, right? Like these things happen to us for an example, right? That would point the way. If we think about the story of Jesus, right? And of his own sacrifice, think about how easy it is to see the parallel, right? Of a father sacrificing. Now, let me just point out some things in this story. Look at verse 2. God says to him, take your son, your only son, whom you love. Right? This language fits the way we think about Jesus, right? This is what New Testament talks about. God's only begotten son, right? The one loved by the Father. He takes him to Moriah, again, takes him to Jerusalem. Here's the Temple Mount, but again, you're very close to where Jesus is sacrificed. If we move forward in this, when Isaac starts asking the questions, where is the lamb? And the language of God will provide it. He'll see to it. Think about John the Baptist, right? When he sees Jesus walking down to the Jordan River, what he said, behold the Lamb of God. Look at verse 4. On the third day, Abraham looks up and he sees the place. Again, this idea of Jesus dies and again resurrected on the third day, this idea of 3 days. Some of the early Christian writers talk about this idea that Isaac is tied, right? He's bound. Abraham's about to sacrifice him. It's as if he's dead, but in a way, this is a picture of resurrection. But in the end, he's alive and he comes back down the hill. And this idea of God providing, again, fits exactly what we understand about the idea that God offers a replacement for us, right? That we're the ones who should have been killed. We're the ones supposed to die for sin. But what happens? The Lord provides, and another offering is sacrificed in our place. So in Christianity, this story of the Akedah ends up being less theologically jolting because we see in it a foreshadowing, a representation, an example of what God does for us through Jesus as the one who would sacrifice a son, and that Abraham almost sacrificing Isaac is a foreshadowing, and that the one who was about to die is replaced as we ourselves are replaced by the Lord in that picture of sacrifice. So let's hear thoughts. Have you thought that before? Like, is that how it has always fit together in your mind? And now seeing it all in this context, does that still feel good, or now does it feel more disturbing?
Well, I'd never heard the idea that it was, to make an example for the rest of the world. Although I think through history, God does that with the Israelites. I always think sometimes they say, why don't you choose another people?
Yeah. Right.
But maybe that's why they took the people with them, so they'd have a witness. The young men, maybe.
Yeah.
And this is totally an aside. I never put this together before. The Lord of the Rings, Moria.
Oh yeah. Oh,
I mean, I never put that
yeah.
together before. Okay.
Yeah. And the other part I forgot to mention that Christian writers have picked up on this story. The fact that Isaac, who is the Christ-like figure, right, who's going up the hill, he's carrying the wood on his back, right? You also have crucifixion imagery there.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, it's a gold mine for Christian theologians, right? we don't have to process this through, you know, the tragedy of persecution, suffering, and a history of massacre like Judaism does. When you then have the backstory of a God who asks a father to sacrifice a son.
I was thinking during all this that what does this mean for us? And when you look at different religions, even today, I think often we look at each other and say, well, do you take your faith life seriously? How seriously? Are you willing to sacrifice food? Are you willing to sacrifice animals, which evidently was better than food? Are you willing to sacrifice your own son? And then even in modern times, are you willing to sacrifice not alcohol or other things like that? Or are you willing to sacrifice electricity? And so there's all this back and forth among different religions, maybe each one saying, well, I'm willing to sacrifice more than you are. So as we read these Old Testament studies, it seems as if, I know I'm saying to myself, wow, I'm really glad I didn't live during those times.
That's right.
It's a lot better today. But are we prone to be vulnerable to have other people say, well, yeah, you're glad that you're not living in those days, but you don't sacrifice at all. You don't take it at all seriously. What good are you?
Right.
And so there's all this give and take among different people of different ages. I think our sacrifice might be a little different. It's not so much that we give something up for Lent or something minor like that, meat and eat fish instead, but maybe our sacrifices are more productive. Instead of losing a son, we're actually teaching our son to go out and do something worthwhile.
Yeah.
And so that would be how we would take our religion seriously. That would be my argument to others who would say you don't take it seriously.
Right.
But once again, we don't really know.
But you know, this idea, you're right, because the idea of sacrifice, that one would go to that level.
Right.
I mean, you know, for most modern people, they're thinking, wait, what? You're saying
Right.
give 10%? Which really doesn't feel like a big deal when you're letting your firstborn son die.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, the idea of sacrifice is one I agree, Bill. I think in a modern society, we kind of lost the sense of that, because it seems like in many ways, particularly in the West, and particularly in America, the idea that, you know, we would almost mock this, but we realize that we fall into the trap of it, of prosperity gospel that says God's favor is seen in blessing, not in having less. And so when we look at things going well, we go, well, that's God favoring it, right? We're not asked to do hard things, give up hard things. We expect if we do the right thing, right, there's a good payoff in the end. But clearly the payoff, right, in the end, it takes a turn. But for Abraham, it seemed as if being so righteous and being part of the covenant has a heavy demand on it. And that's not the kind of religion we often feel comfortable with. Other thoughts?
I always think of these stories, and the one thing that comes back to me is actions speak louder than words. It's like they start each one of these stories, and there's a premise that you start with. Either, you know, he tells Isaac or he tells Abraham to do this, and it's like you can't stop because you got to see what God does. Or in those stories where, you know, there were the relations between the women and the men that were not proper. You know, that was what man told you, and that wasn't going to happen. It's like, you got to wait because God's going to work here, you know, and God is just kind of showing that he is going to act. He's not going to just tell you what to do. He's going to be an active participant in whatever's going on.
Yeah. That's a really powerful statement. And let me just, you don't have to answer it out loud, but about whether or not in your mind you think of God as an active participant in our world. There's this description of modern religion, really it's postmodern religion among youth. And when they survey them out, and we're talking about kids that we would call Christian churched kids, when they do these surveys about, well, what do you believe about this? What do you believe about that? There's this great book called Almost Christian. And in it, it says our kids that we call Christians, and they might be in our youth groups and our churches, and they might seem dedicated, they're not theologically really what we would call Christian. They're moral therapeutic deists. What does that mean? Moral, well, they believe that being a Christian means you're supposed to do, good things versus bad things. So you've got to be a good person. Therapeutic means, like I always joke about the religion of Oprah-anity, right? It's this idea that if you're a good Christian person, it's got that therapeutic aspect of how do I feel good about myself? How do I interact well with other people? How do I not make other people feel uncomfortable? Can I get along with everybody? And deist is that, yeah, there's a God out there and he got stuff started, but he's really not involved in any, direct, concrete way. That's our job. And so when you, and again, in my role dealing with students in a Christian school, when you really poke into it, sometimes that I'll be I will be confrontational about it. Sometimes we'll do this in a class and we'll list out like what Orthodox Christianity says, then moral therapeutic deism. And I'm like, I don't think many of you are Christians. And a lot of times I go, yeah, we line up more over there. At least admitting it. Anyway, but this book, Almost Christian, goes through like, well, how do you shift that? How do you get students to really engage what is a deep Christian faith that says, one, it's not just about being good, right? Like that goes against our idea about grace. And it's not just about making other people feel good and you feeling good yourself, because most of these Bible stories are about Abraham on the way. And in the New Testament, we see the conflict in community about what's right and wrong. Like sometimes we have to confront, and God is actively involved. But I think we too also fall into that moral therapeutic deism as well. Great comment there. What else? Other thoughts that this passage brings to mind?
Well, on the moral deism, I suspect all of us are maybe in the middle, because we do feel that God's active in our lives. Otherwise, we wouldn't pray for this and that.
Yeah.
Mainly for other people in need.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, if God is so active that he orchestrates everything, then why did God kill that 4-year-old? Why did he give this father and mother of 6 in a car wreck? And so forth and so on.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm thinking of what you're saying is thinking I'm somewhere in the middle.
Right. Well, and you know what? And that's the theodicy issue, right? Like if bad things in the world, how is God involved? And some people, it's easier to just go, well, he probably isn't.
I wouldn't say that.
To say, no, God can be involved in the world, but when God chooses to act and when God doesn't is the hard problem. Yeah.
It's hard. Yeah.
Julie's in the background telling me to make a plug, but
go ahead, make a plug.
Yeah, what?
Well, she said if you see her new book that just came out and it shows how God works through the life of her father in his ministry. So maybe that would be the answer to everyone's moral therapeutic deism.
She has
She
a
has a new
book.
book.
She has
Yeah,
a book.
Julie's been working for a few years on a memoir with her father. So it just came.
Amazon? Is it on Amazon?
It is on Amazon. It's called, she's handing me a copy. It's COVID time, so we can't have a book signing, I guess. But it's called From Restless to Reconciled, One Man's Journey.
Show it to us.
There you go.
Wow.
Oh, that is awesome.
So that just came this week. So I feel like after 3 years, I got my wife back.
Yeah.
We can put that in the lantern.
Oh, that's so
That is
cool.
awesome. Hey,
Yes.
a new candidate for book club.
There you go. There you go.
Well, you should be plugging that unabashedly, Dean.
What's that?
You should be plugging that unabashedly. I'm pretty sure everyone would want that book. I just wrote it down.
All right. I posted something yesterday on social media. I thought I'll get out there. I'll do the family duty.
You're doing us a favor. It's not a duty, it's a favor.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, my father-in-law is a very interesting man, and he in his circles in the Assemblies of God, he's well known. And it was interesting as Julie was doing all the interviewing and traveling around with him and going to places of his childhood. His story, in a certain ministerial way, in like classical Pentecostal circles, it kind of in some ways reads like one of those Forrest Gump stories where like, just wait, he met them? Oh, when did he meet this person? And there's all these kind of connections he has in his life, which is kind of a fascinating story, which even in their own family, like it wasn't that obvious until Julie really wrote it out and saw all these connections. It was kind of so it was a fun process for her too. So, anyway, any last thoughts? We're at 11. I've hit my limit for holding.
So we're talking about how God is active. I guess for everybody, that could be something different. I mean, it's been a crazy kind of few months for me, with my dad and different family things. But, you feel like things don't happen just serendipitously. Yeah. Sometimes you think there's got to be a reason for that, but you can't put your finger on the reason. And I don't know if that's God or not, but I just feel like some of those things wouldn't have happened, or you don't look at it as a God intervening, unless you had that feeling before it happened, I guess,
Right.
And even from people who you wouldn't consider, really, Christian people, things happen and you're thinking, well, why did that person reach out to them? It just wasn't, it wasn't something that happened the week before, the month before, the year before, but it happened and it made a difference.
Yeah.
And I don't get, that's something I'm still trying to figure out.
I have found in my own life that seeing God at work, I'm a lot better at in hindsight.
Mhm.
So I have had to wrestle with myself to learn to live with a hopeful kind of mindset moving forward, that God is acting and working in things that don't always make sense, with the faith that in the end, I look back and I see how all those things connect and piece together. And I'll close us with this. I did devotions for faculty. I do devotions for my faculty each week. And this week, we did a little exercise. From the time I was a kid, and I don't even know what year this started, but on New Year's Eve, we didn't have the good, exciting, go rock it out New Year's Eves because I was a Pentecostal kid. So we would pray Jesus in because Jesus had to come back on New Year's Day. We always figured, I guess. So I'm exaggerating a bit, but there were these, they were called watch services. You prayed in the new year. But then I got into this habit of lying in bed on New Year's Eve And I would go back through my mind and try to think of like a great memory from each month of the year. And I still do that, like on New Year's Eve. I think like, what happened in January? What's something that sticks out from February? And what we did in devotions this week is I said all year long, all we've done, and I don't mean this in a snide way, but I mean, we continually talk about like how horrible 2020's been. And it's caused this weird kind of thinking that I sometimes read things, and I know people can't really think this, but it's like magically when we strike midnight into 2021, it's like everything's gonna be back to normal. Right? Like it's like, no, I don't know that it's gonna all go away. But in our mind, it's a 2020 thing, right? So here's what we did, and I challenge you to find a time to do this week. Is sit down with a piece of paper. I gave everyone a note card. Write down every month from January forward and think about something you're thankful for in each month of the year. And then we kind of just started sharing, and people started like thinking, oh my gosh, I forgot this great thing happened, or I saw God at work in this thing. I forgot that happened. And because especially in our CHC community, I mean, one, everybody's dealt with the virus, and so we had to shut school down. And so school's different and teaching's harder and everything's rough that way. We lost our first student last March who died in the car accident. We lost our first current teacher in April, the day before Easter. We've lost 1, 2, 3. I've been to 3 parent funerals this fall. I was at a faculty member's husband's funeral in the spring. I mean, there's been so much death, so much heaviness, and it's just seen as like, this has been one terrible year. Let's just get done with it. But again, when we stopped and went back, we said, you know what? But even in the midst of this, God has been working. Even in the midst of this, there are things to be thankful for. But our minds have taken a bent with everything going on that sees the negative first. And we have to work to see the things for which we are thankful. So I'll just challenge you this week to try to find time to do that, so that as we end this year, we realize it's not all for naught. It's not a throwaway year, but God's been working. We have blessings and we have things to be thankful. So let me pray. God, we thank you for this day. I thank you for this group. I thank you for our chance to come together every week, even virtually, to do life together, to share, to learn, to grow. God, as we wrestle with a very difficult passage this week, help us not just to learn things about the ancient world or about Jewish and Christian traditions, but at the same time that we find ourselves in this story. God, help us be aware of how you call us sometimes to do hard things. Help us be aware that living a life of faith and following you calls for sacrifice. Help us to be aware, though, that you are always in control. Help us be aware that you always provide, even when provision seems impossible. Help us to see, God, that everything going on in our lives is part of a greater story. So, God, I thank you for writing this story and that we don't write it ourselves, but you call us to live it out, to act it out, and that you prepare it and you prepare the story before us. So God, be with us this week. Let us be thankful. Let our hearts be full. Bless our families, our loved ones. Keep us healthy and whole. Be with Trinity as we move into Advent season soon. Prepare us, I pray. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen.
Hey, great to see you all.
Thank you.
See you at Virtual Pie Fest.
Yes.
Thank you. Happy Thanksgiving.
Greetings to everyone.
Probably. Thanks, y'all.
Bye.